Following on from the Module 4 Part 1 lecture, this lecture forms Part 2 of a lecture on the social and cognitive development of young children. Remember that when you hear the word social development or the term social development in this course, you can consider that to be the same as psychosocial development. It's also a lecture to inform Module 5 theoretical topic of childhood, enhancing growth and development and a sense of self and independence. The focus of this lecture is on adaptation and adjustments of early childhood from approximately 3 to 5 years and later childhood between 6 and 12 years. There's a specific focus on the cognitive development of children overall, exploring further the work of Piaget and introducing the work of Vygotsky, who was also a theorist interested in the cognitive development of children. There'll be a little bit on the social development of children, and the reading for this week also examines prosocial behaviour and antisocial behaviour, which you can follow up in tutorials. In tutorials this week, there is going to be a focus on the cognitive development of children, supporting health and learning, parenting and discipline, and further work on transition to preschool and school, relationships with peers, and the predictable and unpredictable transitions of childhood. The readings for this week include all the material that we will introduce you to. So first of all, in Chapter 2, the reading focuses on the complete model of cognitive development of Piaget. In Part 1 of the lecture, I was only talking about the first stage of Piaget's model of child development, and this was called the sensory motor stage. If the midwifery students are using Piaget to inform their work, then their focus will be on the sensory motor stage. The second stage of Piaget's theory is the pre-operational stage, which will be furthered in tutorials this week. And that second stage, if Bachelor of Nursing students are using Piaget to inform their work, that is called the pre-operational stage, and that would be the appropriate stage to focus on. Chapter 6 in this week's reading focuses on some unpredictable events of childhood, specifically childhood injury, and gives further information about the pre-operational stage of cognitive development, which is children between 2 and 7 years. Prosocial behaviour, temperament, antisocial behaviour, aggression, and some of the influences on children in the external environment are introduced in the reading in Chapter 7. And the third stage of Piaget's theory of cognitive development is emphasised in pages 282 to 285. And Piaget's third stage focused on children between 7 and 11 years. Pages 287 to 288 refer to Vygotsky, who is another cognitive theorist and who I'll refer to towards the end of this lecture. In terms of social development, the childhood stage of Erikson, industry versus inferiority, and its relationship to the sense of self gained in childhood and the influence of peers and social relationships is covered between pages 312 to 316. Similarly to infant and toddler development, physical development throughout childhood is extremely important. There are predictable and unpredictable events, but there are also milestones and other documents that can help us assess whether a child's meeting their physical, cognitive and social milestones. There are more individual differences in body size in early childhood than in infancy or adolescence, but children of similar age are capable of exhibiting a wide variation in growth patterns. Unlike the period of infancy, physical growth starts to slow down in the preschool years. The average height of a 3-year-old is about 95 centimetres, and by 5 years of age, they're around 105 centimetres. By the age 6, brain growth is about 90% of the adult size. But despite these predictable normative milestones and guidelines, there are significant differences. Children who are significantly larger or significantly smaller than average experience a number of related effects. For example, the expectations of a larger child is often that they are more cognitively advanced than they really are and more capable than their actual maturation. On the other hand, smaller children are sometimes at risk of injury in normal rough and tumble play with their larger and stronger peers. Children who are small for their age are at a greater risk of play-related injury, and a smaller body size may make it difficult for a child to master certain physical activities that involve strength and endurance. If a child is significantly taller or heavier than their peers, it is most likely that they're going to be stronger and potentially more coordinated. So this could lead to issues when it comes to playing with peers. So safe play opportunities with age peers where physical size is irrelevant is recommended, as well as matching children in physical size for certain activities. We always need to also remember that the cognitive age of a child doesn't always match their physical appearance. So age-appropriate interactions are important to maintain. Another unpredictable event of childhood is that accidents are the main cause of childhood mortality in industrialised nations, with traffic-related injuries, burns and drowning the most common cause of death. If children do not die as a result of such injuries, they can of course be significantly disabled by them. And if that's the case, physical development, cognitive development and socio-emotional development may be negatively affected. Physical, cognitive and motor developments lead to preschool children outgrowing a need for constant regulated supervision, but parents still need to intervene to make sure that their children are physically safe. If you review Table 6.3 in Hoffnung et al. On page 202, there are common sources of injuries, remedies, and the prevention of unintentional injuries, particularly in preschoolers. In Australia and other developed nations, drowning is one of the 3 leading causes of accidental death in 0 to 4-year-olds. And in some jurisdictions, drowning is in fact the leading cause of injury-related death in that particular age group. Every year, hundreds of children aged 0 to 4 experience also a non-fatal drowning, which is sometimes called a near drowning. Tragically, 22.5% of those admitted to hospital following a non-fatal drowning will suffer a hypoxic brain injury due to the lack of oxygen that they've experienced, and that will result in disabilities that are lifelong. A hypoxic brain injury can often lead to the inability to swallow, seizures, and other distressing physical effects. Many children who survive a hypoxic brain injury will need a wide range of equipment, support, and services for life. There are some gender issues when it comes to accidents in children. Boys are 1.5 times more likely to incur an accident, and in terms of temperament, irritable or inattentive children are at a higher risk than placid and cooperative children for obvious reasons. Poverty is seen to impact negatively, and there's a negative correlation, so the higher the degree of poverty, the more likely it is that a child may suffer some sort of accident or injury. And parental vigilance is essential right through the period of childhood. In addition to that, parents are charged with teaching rules about safety, conducting safety inventories of their home, and minimising environmental hazards. All of these issues can affect the cognitive and social development of children who are unfortunate enough to sustain and not recover fully from an accident or some sort of injury. Piaget's theory of cognitive development is going to be covered as a whole in tutorials this week, and there are 4 broad stages. The stage of childhood is actually called concrete operations, so I'll just quickly run through them so that you can locate both this week's topic and the essay topics within Piaget's model. If you were writing about the midwifery topic, the sensory motor stage is from birth to 2 years, and I've already addressed that in the previous lecture. The pre-operational stage of child development is between 2 and 7 years, so that's the stage of cognitive development that Bachelor of Nursing students might like to focus on if they're writing about Piaget in the essay task. Tutorials this week will talk a little bit about early childhood, but more so about childhood itself, between the age of about 7 and 11 according to Piaget, and 6 to 12 according to Erikson. So there are minor differences in chronological age of the different theorists, as you've probably already recognised. But there are significant differences between the cognitive functioning of a pre-operational child before 7 and a concrete operational child after 7, and we'll be exploring that further in tutorials. When we get to adolescence, after the age of 11, 12, and sometimes a bit older for some children, they enter the final stage of Piaget's theory of cognitive development, called the formal operational stage. There are some concepts in Piaget's work that are important to understand. There is a movement from the pre-operational stage, from the sensory motor stage to the pre-operational stage that's quite significant, and this is called symbolic representation. So when children start to pretend that one object is another, you find that they increase that ability to pretend, and it's called symbolic representation. So that's an important aspect that marks the end of the sensory motor period and the beginning of the pre-operational period. During the pre-operational period and further into the concrete operational period, children are continuing to refine and learn and adapt to the environment. The two processes that allow them to adapt was mentioned in part 1 of the lecture, but these are the processes of assimilation and accommodation. In assimilation, Piaget claimed that children use existing schemes to deal with new information and experiences, and this is what they do to take in new information. In accommodation, they are adjusting those schemes to deal with the new information and modifying and understanding new information. So when a child sees a zebra for the first time, she or he may call it a horse. So the child initially assimilates the information into her schema for a horse. But when the child accommodates the information, she takes into consideration the different properties of a zebra compared to a horse, and that might have something to do with stripes and different colours. And eventually she or he may learn the name zebra, and then she's accommodated that particular concept. When a child learns the word for dog, which often happens quite early, or cat as the case may be, they often start to call all four-legged animals dogs, and that's assimilation. People around them will of course say, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat, or that's not a cat, that's a squirrel. And their schema for dog then gets modified to restrict the word dog to only certain four-legged animals, and that's called accommodation. One of the amusing things that often happens when children learn the word mummy or daddy is if the father has some particular characteristic. My husband has a beard that he's had all the time that I've known him, but a child sometimes mistakes other adults for their dad. So when a child learns that his father is called daddy, he could call out to other males who look like daddy, and that's assimilation. That's certainly what my son did once or twice when he was learnt the word dad and saw other men around with a beard that heavily represented my husband's beard. When the child has accommodated different names and personalities and even genders, they quickly learn that the other person isn't their dad, and that's called accommodation. So their schema for the word dad is modified. With babies, when babies are sucking on various sorts of bottles, they can adapt fairly quickly. Not all babies, actually. Breastfed babies don't adapt terribly well to artificial nipples at times, but if a baby's bottle fed, they can often adapt to different sorts of bottles and styles, and it's a fairly easy assimilation for them. But most children have a little bit of difficulty when they move from either a breast to a bottle or a bottle to a sippy cup. And a sippy cup is something that makes the fluid come out not quite as fast as a normal cup, but a lot faster than a bottle. It doesn't require sucking. And so that's something that a lot of children buck on when they're first introduced to that. But many of them accommodate very soon after that. They basically get used to it and they accept it. So that's another process of accommodation. These are the ways that a child learns new knowledge and incorporates it into their existing schemas. It's part of a child's adaptation, the way in which they learn to categorise the world, and also the way in which they learn. It's evidenced in language and in the naming of objects and events. And Piaget said that the balance between assimilation and accommodation is called an equilibrium. Interestingly enough, as adults, we go on to assimilate and accommodate right through our lives. And it's something that does happen when one is exposed to often higher education, new ideas, thoughts and writings that you might not have come across before. So sometimes people have a schema that's not particularly helpful to the social world. They can have a racist schema, for example, or a homophobic schema. So their whole life they might have grown up and just add more and more information to that particular schema, because what we tend to do is interpret things that we see in terms of what we know already. So we all do it. It's not just children that do it. And if we are always interpreting something that fits with our schema, then we basically never change. But when people start being exposed to new ideas, they might actually meet people from the group where they've already got a pre-established prejudice perhaps. And the research shows that direct contact with people or groups with which people have negative attitudes is often what is needed to change those attitudes into more positive attitudes. And when people learn from real life interaction, that requires a radical reorganisation of their existing schema. That requires accommodation, and this is what people do. The new schema that they develop might be completely different, or it might build on something that they already know. But that's an example of how accommodation and assimilation happen right through our life. So this is just a visual representation of what I just spoke about. Vygotsky was a person that was a contemporary of Piaget. He died quite early in life, which was the only reason that he didn't continue his debate and work building upon Piaget's work. But he compared, he, like Piaget, looked at the cognitive development of children. And whereas Piaget's theory states that all children develop along similar paths, often regardless of environmental influences, in contrast, Vygotsky's theory posed that culture and socialization play a critical role in child development. Piaget also believed that brain development in the individual child allows that child to develop skills, but Vygotsky felt that the internal environment wasn't necessarily the only thing that predicted cognitive and social development. He suggested that those processes happen simultaneously, with both being supported by outside influences such as parents and peers. Similarly to Piaget, Vygotsky has a couple of key principles in his theoretical model which you may wish to talk about if you're using Vygotsky as a cognitive theorist for your written work. One of the things that he said was that competence leads to more independence, and he talked about various techniques. Reciprocal learning is something that informs reading and comprehension, and educators try different models of teaching children to read. The reciprocal learning is based on getting children to skim read something, then focus on the most important parts of it, read it more carefully, ask questions about it, discuss it. So it's actually used in education most of the time. But scaffolding is something that we can use to explain how all adults inform the cognitive development of children. And scaffolding is based on something that's critical to Vygotsky's work. It's called the zone of proximal development. And within that zone of proximal development, if there's an expert with a more novice learner, and if it's at the right time, if the person's asking for help with a task or a skill or asking for knowledge, then scaffolding is the hints and reminders and questions that the expert engages in to get the person to remember it for the next time or to build upon it. So when we think of a scaffold, we're building upon knowledge. The zone of proximal development, though, was Vygotsky's contribution, and this is the thing that makes him a sociocultural theorist. So an expert to a child is just anybody that's older than them and more skilled than them. It might be an older sibling, it might be a grandparent, it might be a parent, it might be a teacher, it might be somebody like that. So we'll look at that in the next slide. So Vygotsky's zone of proximal development suggested that there was a readiness when children were wanting to learn something. And if they got to that point where they couldn't complete a task, that was exactly the time that you would step in and help them. And if they asked, all the more better, because they were likely to retain that. So within the zone of proximal development, skills that are too difficult for a child to master on their own can be done with guidance and encouragement from a knowledgeable person, who often initially is the parent or the caregiver. So the zone of proximal development moves children from what is known to what is not known. Vygotsky felt that the internal development and language acquisition were other areas in which parents build on the proximal zone of development. Piaget's theory, however, doesn't emphasize this at all. Piaget actually believed that children learn through their brain maturing, and that was what gave them the brain development to master cognitive tasks. And he hadn't actually thought that anyone in the environment could assist that development, whereas Vygotsky decided that the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate was more important than Piaget realised. His research, as I said, was cut short by his untimely death, whereas Piaget continued his research into child development for many decades after. But if you use both theorists together, which some educators, some paediatric nurses, and often some parents would do, then you have concepts from both that can inform how you understand young children. So as I said, in summary, Vygotsky was slightly different to Piaget. He didn't disagree with Piaget, but he didn't actually think that Piaget's stages were 100%. He allowed for the fact that the stages might be very different for different children depending on how much learning they gained from their social environment. So there was more emphasis on how culture affects cognitive development, and Piaget didn't look at that. He also had more emphasis on social factors, so we'll be looking at Vygotsky again when we look at grandparenting. Vygotsky believed that cognitive development stems from guided learning within the proximal zone of development, whereas Piaget believed that cognitive development stemmed from the maturation of the physical brain and the neurological system. Childhood is also a very rich time of social development, and when a child first starts to show sympathy and empathy for other people, that's something that hopefully they build upon in the future. The influence of peers is important, and children often have an extended social network consisting of friendships, sporting groups, and other such activities. During the period of early childhood, children's social worlds expand outside the family to include other unrelated children of a similar developmental level, and this just continues right through childhood. These relationships are very important for children to practice social skills, give and take, and emotional regulation. But given some of the studies that have been done on children and their inability to delay gratification, that's also linked to emotional regulation. From general peer groups, children form their first friendships, and although these friendships often tend to lack the stability and emotional characteristics of older children's friendships, they do depend often on specific shared interests such as play activities, and sometimes, of course, they are enduring friendships. The quality of children's friendships develops over childhood with loyalty and shared interests, and even the promise of future activity becoming more important than momentarily shared activities. Pro-social and anti-social behaviour and the influences of peers and media, parents, peers and media is covered in the pre-reading, and I'll leave you to read that information. Pro-social behaviour, though, is positive social action that's directed towards making a contribution to the world and assisting other people. And hopefully what we're aiming to do with a lot of the parenting that we engage in is increase the ability of our children to engage in pro-social behaviour rather than anti-social behaviour. In summary, childhood, the area usually classified as between 3 to 5 years. I know some of the slides that we've put up have put, 3 to 6 years. Again, minor differences like that don't really matter. We're talking about the time before a child starts primary school. That's the time of early childhood. And the time of primary school is usually between 6 and 12 years, although, as I said, Piaget talks about 7 to 11 years, but that's, again, just semantics. But this period of childhood, between, broadly speaking, 3 years and 12 years, is a time of enormous physical, cognitive and social growth, with an incredible number of individual variations, normative transitions, and sometimes non-normative transitions. As children work towards the age of approximately 7, they reach the concrete operational stage of development, where their thinking becomes more complex, but is not as complex as an adolescent's cognitive development. A sense of self in childhood is informed by being industrious, by learning and achieving new goals. Social development is enhanced by friendships, activities with those friends, and the peer group is very important. So therefore, bullying would be a non-normative, unpredictable transition of childhood. That's something that could affect the cognitive and social development of a child. It's something that there's now legislation around in schools, and it's something that is now recognised as important to prevent. And if children are experiencing bullying, either cyberbullying, personal bullying, even bullying from adults, we also need to take into consideration from a nursing perspective and a midwifery perspective that children at all ages are exceptionally vulnerable. So child protection is important, child safety is important, and recognising that vulnerability is important. That's because children below the age of 12, or Piaget would say below the age of 11, don't have the capacity to make the same evaluations of others as an adolescent child might have, which is why child protection is so important. That's the end of the second part of the lecture. I hope both part 1 and part 2 are helpful to you making some decisions about your written work in this unit. There is going to be a webinar held by the library on library searching skills, and PICO webinars on structuring the assignment in future weeks. Thank you. And bye for now.